Okay.
Welcome everyone to Coffee and Conversation with the Rabbi. I have two very special guests here today. Doron Kotkovsky has been a friend of mine for many decades, and his nephew, Eitan Kotkovsky. They're going to be talking about their grandfather and father's book, Wilds of Destiny, which was a memoir about their father and grandfather, Yitzhak's escape from the Nazis in World War II. And so I'm really happy to have both of you here. And I just wanted to give you a chance to introduce each of yourselves to our congregation and to our audience generally. You can start, either one.
Ethan, you start.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's always nice to talk about my grandpa's book and his life. It's very fulfilling in many ways. So just briefly, my grandfather and I were very close when I was young, since I was very young. And so he would tell me all of the stories over and over again. I've read his book several times, and I was always amazed by it and just very curious about what his life was like and the family tree and the pictures that he would share. And so I became like the self-appointed family historian. And so that's my work in his life, and helping him write his speeches that he gave at different places and filming them. So yeah, I was very involved with my grandfather's work. Personally, professionally, I have a PhD in neuroimaging. I graduated from college with a bachelor's in psychology, and I'm in an MD PhD program right now, finishing up medical school next spring. So that's
wow, wow.
So amazing rise from my father's life, his survival, having such a bright young man in Ethan. It's amazing, eh? How life works.
Oh, but what about you, Doron?
No, I'm not that bright as you. By the way, my name is Doron Kotkovsky, and very proud of my father and talk about him, and very proud of my nephew, and he's a very good friend of Dana. So.
And what do you do professionally?
I'm the director of international trade and customs for a multinational, which basically tend to between import duties, exports, all these issues.
Okay, good. So let's get right into the subject. So I read your grandfather's book, Eitan. When Doron first gave it to me, when the first edition first came out, it was not like your typical Holocaust memoir, in that it really wasn't depressing at all. It was quite, but the first part was very frightening and upsetting. So maybe you can set the stage. Your grandfather Yitzhak was born in Warsaw, correct, in Poland. That was the largest city by far in Poland, and we picture Polish Jews as being ultra Orthodox, and that didn't come across in your father's book at all. They seemed very modern, almost like living lives not that different from our lives. So let's start there. Tell us a little bit about Yitzhak's life in Warsaw until World War II broke out in September 1st, 1939.
Okay, so there's a lot, obviously. Jewish life in Warsaw was actually very diverse. It wasn't exclusive to the Orthodox community, even though my great-grandfather, Yitzhak's father, Abraham, considered himself a modern Orthodox Jew. He would go and daven to the synagogue. He would keep Shabbos. He would be part of the minyan. He was actually involved in, I forgot what the Jewish term was, those who take care of the dead and wrap them in the sheet and prepare their bodies for burial. Yes, exactly. So he was part of that. But by and large, they grew up in a household that spoke Polish. Typically, Jews in Poland and Eastern Europe spoke Yiddish in the household. But in my grandfather's household, even though both his parents spoke Yiddish, they spoke Polish to the kids. And they went to Polish language schools, and they were very much immersed in Polish life, because even though they went to Jewish schools, they were more secular schools. So it would be almost as if you were to send kids to like a Reformed Jewish school nowadays, if that makes any sense. So they were very modern in that sense. They were very secular, as secular as Jews could be in Poland at the time. And they lived in a very typical middle-class household. They had an apartment with running water, which was new back in those days. My great-grandfather had a cutlery shop. He had a store that sold cutlery and haberdashery, so just like things that he would import from Germany and other places and sell. And my great-grandmother was a housewife. She was one of 14 siblings, and so it was a very big extended family from my great-grandmother's side of the family. And my grandpa and his sister Anya would always describe their childhood as being very happy. Like, it was very happy-go-lucky. They didn't really experience any anti-Semitism. They knew that it existed. Like, there were people out there who said bad things about Jews, but they themselves never experienced any specific anti-Semitism. In part because at least my great aunt Anya didn't look too Jewish. She had more quote unquote Aryan features, and so she wasn't really questioned too much about that. And my grandfather spoke perfect Polish. He could even imitate accents from different Polish, like the different Polish dialects across the country. So he could speak Polish slang, and so people never really bothered him or questioned his Polish.
Did they have non-Jewish friends, or it was not that open?
They did have a handful of non-Jewish friends. I know my great aunt Anya had a couple of non-Jewish friends, but the vast majority of their friends were Jewish. In fact, the family member, my great aunt Marisha, the oldest sister who left Poland in 1936 to Mexico City, she was a pianist. She went to the Conservatory for Music in Warsaw to study music and piano and singing. And so at the conservatory, that's obviously not a Jewish institution. So a lot of the non-Jewish friends that would pop in and spend time at my grandfather's house back when they were young were from my great aunt Marisha's, like, close group of friends.
Doron, can you, I mean, Yitzhak was your father, and yet, as we know, sometimes it's easier to talk to grandchildren than to children. But did your father tell you anything about his upbringing before the war that would be interesting?
I just remember some pictures that he had, like swimming, and I remember he told me he used to like to have sports and play volleyball, and have a very normal life. Basically, that's what I remember.
They liked watching Westerns.
Oh, they had a TV?
No, they went to the movies. Like, there were like, yeah, when the first talkies came out, like the Western talkies in the 1930s, apparently that was a big thing. I've heard that from other survivors that I've seen, like, their interviews.
So the Polish people, Jewish and non-Jewish, went to the movie theater to watch American Western movies.
Right, with no subtitles.
Was John Wayne making movies by then, or was that afterwards?
I think so. It wasn't his first movie in like 1928 or something. Oh. That's a random fact that I know. I'm sorry.
So a lot of what they knew about America was the cowboys and Indians.
Right.
Now then, of course, everything changed on September 1st, 1939. From the history books, we all know that the Nazis and the German army rolled into Poland. And there was approximately 3 weeks, as I recall it, a 3-week battle. And the Germans were rolling these beautiful new high-tech tanks. And the Polish cavalry was on horseback, I think, literally. So it was more like a slaughter than a war. But it took them about 3 weeks to capture the country. And this is before the Allies came into the war, I believe. But this caused the Allies or caused Great Britain to declare war on, and France as well, to declare war on Germany. But they weren't able to get there to help. Can you tell us a little? So Yitzhak is how old at this time?
17. About to turn 18. Yeah.
So he's just about to turn 18. He's living with his parents. And how many brothers and sisters did he have?
So he had his oldest sister, Marisha, who left Poland in 1937 or 38, right before the war, to go to Mexico City. And so she escaped, or she avoided everything in World War II altogether. he had an older sister, Anya, who has her own incredible story. We won't get into that too much right now, but she survived and ended up in New York, and her family is there now. And my grandfather was number 3, and then the youngest sister, Dorenka, who was 3 years old at the start of the war.
Oh, wow. And so, what did you? I remember from the book Yitzhak that once the German soldiers came in, they called for Jewish men of a certain age to come forward for forced labor or for labor. And Yitzhak took one look at the soldiers and he knew that there was a very bad situation developing.
Well, there's some interesting things that I think are important to mention. So first of all, his father, my great-grandfather, because he owned a shop and did a lot of business dealings with Germans, had a very high impression of Germans. So it was very unbelievable to my great-grandfather that the Germans would do such a terrible thing. Like, he would always say, no, Germans are very civilized. It's the people that gave us Beethoven, they gave us Mozart, like they would never do such things. Something must be terribly wrong. But then 1931 came. It started off by bombardment. So the Germans sent the airplanes, and all of Warsaw was bombed, and a lot of it was destroyed. And then that's when they came in with the tanks. And according to my grandpa, in the radio, they would say, so proud, like the German army would say proudly, oh, we will defend Poland. The Germans don't stand a chance. We have the bravest fighters. We're the best, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a lot of propaganda in that sense. But like you said, in 3 weeks, there was a total slaughter. Like the Polish people, the Polish army still had a cavalry, and they were fighting against tanks. As I said, literally, they had no chance at all. But then, as you mentioned, after the bombing and after the Germans rolled in, they started to recruit young people to help clean up the city. So the Germans started to create their own offices, headquarters, army headquarters, and they needed, the populace to clean everything up. And my grandpa encountered, he worked an entire day. He had recently recovered from typhus, and so he wasn't at his best in terms of strength. And when he requested from a German guard to go back home, the German guard, my grandpa would always like to tell the story, he was a horrible face. The man had a very deformed face, either from a burn or something. And after asking, could I go home, he got hit with the butt of a rifle on his face, and that completely took him off guard. It startled him. Something changed in his brain. This is wrong. Something is definitely off with what's going on here, and it's very dangerous to stay. And so he went back home, and he told his family, I don't think I can stay. I think it'll be dangerous for me to stay here. I'm leaving Warsaw. And my great grandfather Abraham was like, no, why would you do that? Why would you leave the family? We have to remain together. I'm sure this will be over soon. It's all politics. The Germans are very civilized people. They would never do such a thing, et cetera, et cetera. But my great grandmother, on the other hand, had a very different take on it. And she basically told my grandfather and my great grandfather, in times of war, nobody has a right to choose anyone else's destiny or to force anyone else into something else. So with that, my great grandmother gave my grandfather the blessing to leave Poland, and she gave him some money, some food, and an address to go to Bialystok on the Russian, because of course Poland was divided by the Nazis and the Russians. So it was a split between the two. And so my grandfather wanted to go to the Russian side. He felt it was going to be safer. And so he did. He went to Bialystok in the Russian side of occupied Poland.
So tell us a little bit about the personality of Yitzhak. So he was a pretty independent, adventurous kind of guy. I mean, I knew him in his later years, very later years, and he still was very, with a tremendous joie de vivre and independent and exciting. He liked excitement, right?
Doran, you want to comment?
No, yes, he was always, a happy man. He liked operas, and he went with us to go jogging and ride horses when we used to live in Mexico. Yes.
Yeah. So he also importantly, because my great aunt Marisha was already in Mexico City. My grandfather loved his older sister. He was amazed by her because she was a pianist and he loved music and opera. And so he was trying, it's important to the rest of the story. He was learning Spanish, first of all, in Poland, because he wanted to go to Mexico to visit his sister. And he was applying to the Mexican consulate to get a visa to go to Mexico at the time the war broke out. So his plan was, after finishing high school, so he only had a semester and a little bit left when he turned 18, he wanted to go to Mexico. So that was his plan. And then the war broke out, and the rest of what we'll discuss.
So then he tells his parent, he doesn't really ask, he tells his parents, I want to leave. And the logical place to go was Russia. And especially his mother said, okay. And they gave him some money, and then he just took a train.
Yeah, essentially. Maybe not a train. It was like several trucks and buses to get to Bialystok, which was on the Russian side, because there were family friends who lived there, and they would give him shelter and they would allow him to stay.
And there was no roadblocks or anybody saying you can't leave.
At that point, no, because it was so early. It was still very early in the war. It was only a few days after the Germans entered Warsaw. So it was rather easy for people to move around at that point still.
But people, and you said a couple of times that your great-grandfather couldn't believe that anything terrible could happen. Was that a rumor that something terrible could happen, or was that just totally not being considered?
So I guess, as with anything, some people play it off as a rumor, and some people take it very seriously. There was definitely, you could see with the rise of Hitler that there was a lot of anti-Semitism and a lot of anti-Jewish laws that were being passed since 1933 up until 1939. And so there was definitely talk of this rising crazy fanatic in Germany who was very much against the Jews, but very few, people would, back at those days, you only heard rumors through the radio. You didn't take things as seriously as, I guess, as you do now with the internet and everything. You see so much information all the time, but back then people were only concerned with their immediate lives, like their own business, their own shops. They only knew about the news in their little community and could really care less about news in the outside world for the most part. But those who knew were very worried.
But it's one thing to have anti-Semitic laws that say would prevent you from becoming a doctor, and another thing to do mass murder. Was there a rumor that the Germans were gonna try to kill all the Jews, or was it just these are not nice people and they may, not let us do all sorts of things?
I think my father, I remember, he told me that he had the feeling that when this German soldier hit him, that something wrong will happen. It's more like he had this inside him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that's the key. Like, for those who are just experiencing, like, okay, there's bombardment, there's a war going on, especially my great-grandfather who went through World War I, like, he knew what war was like. Didn't really, or maybe they just imagined that it would be similar to World War I, and that it was just nations fighting against nations, armies against armies, a few civilian casualties, were caught in like a famine, but nothing that's targeted toward a specific group of people. So it was, I think my great-grandfather probably had that in the back of his mind. Like, oh, the Germans were the bad guys in World War I, but they definitely didn't like commit genocide in World War I. So why would they do it this time? So I think, and my grandfather, who had never experienced war, all of a sudden gets this very strange feeling from this very aggressive German soldier. And so that was enough for him.
And you think the German soldiers were being told, we're going to kill the Jews?
I don't think so. I think, or at least not a lot of them, because especially in the invasion of Poland, the Germans recruited a lot of ethnic German Poles. So a lot of towns that were part of the, inside the Polish borders had German speakers. And so a lot of Germans, or the German army recruited individuals from those communities. And so it wasn't like the final decision or anything like that was not really talked about yet, like among the German army. It wasn't until after the Warsaw Ghetto was being built and they were talking, like they were building Treblinka, that didn't really happen until a few months after the start of the war. So at the beginning of the war, there was hardly any talk of that, especially among the local population or the lower ranked soldiers.
So did your father take a suitcase with him and pack like electric toothbrush, or was it more like running out of the house with just the money in his pocket?
It's like a knapsack, you know, like with a stick and a little.
For that time, I mean, in other words, was he just running out, or was it kind of like I'm going on a little trip?
The idea was to leave German occupied Poland and wait it out until it was safe to come back home. That was the main idea. And that brings us, I guess, to the next stage, which is interesting because he was in Bialystok and he was like, for a living, he would buy old, like broken watches and sell it to the Russian army. Like apparently Russian soldiers really liked watches, even though they didn't work because they were stylish. So my grandpa made a bunch of money just like buying old watches from local Poles and then selling them to the Russians. And so he made a few ends meet during that time. But his birthday is on December 25th. And during the time of his birthday, he was feeling very homesick. Of course, we get a birthday party and everything with his family. And so around that time, around New Year's, a few days after his birthday, he decided to go back to Poland. And by that point, it's already been several months of both the Russian and the German occupation. So the borders were already stricter. And so he got on a truck that would take them across the border to the Polish or to the German occupied side of Warsaw. And in the middle of the trip, someone drops a letter or a note in the snow. Who knows if it was planted, but the guard at the border, the Russian guard, looks at the letter, and it's from the Radziwill family, which is like a very wealthy Polish family, like they were royalty or something along those lines, very much against communism. So because of course the Soviets were very communist, and anything that had to do with royalty or royal titles was very much a no-no. And so they started to interrogate. They asked everyone in the truck, like, who does it belong to? Nobody fessed up. And so they interrogated each one individually. And so when they interrogated my grandfather, he of course had all his papers with him, including his application to go to Mexico. So he still had like his application for the Mexican consulate, waiting for a visa or a quota to emigrate to Mexico. And as it so happens, a famous Russian was in Mexico at that time. So Stalin's greatest rival after Lenin died was Leo Trotsky. And Leo Trotsky famously went to Mexico City to escape persecution from, he was in the side of the whites in the Russian Revolution, and Stalin was the side of the reds. So they really wanted to kill Trotsky. And so of course the connection was, oh, your sister who's in Mexico must be a Polish spy for the whites. And that means you're a spy and you're a threat to the Communist Party, and so you're going to prison. And so they sentenced him to prison in Bialystok. So he went back to Bialystok, but this time he was in the prison in Bialystok with a bunch of enemies of the state, a bunch of common thieves and murderers.
That's what saved his life, essentially.
Kind of. I mean, at least it saved his life from the Germans, but it's as many or more people died under Soviet Russia than they did under the Nazis, which a few people tend to acknowledge. So that's another, like, we can move on to that, but that's a very fascinating story too.
So Yitzhak never got back to his family. Mm-hmm. Now, right. If he hadn't gotten into that trouble at the border, he would have gone back to Poland under Nazi occupation. Wasn't that, now, if he had a bad feeling about them several months earlier, didn't he have a very bad feeling about them later?
What's interesting is that he had a very bad feeling about both. He had a bad feeling about the communists and had a bad feeling about the Nazis. Wow. And so that's why in his book, Doran, if you don't mind showing the book, with the cover of his book, you have the Wells of Destiny, and you have fire with the swastika and then the sickle and hammer on both sides. So he's caught in the middle of these two horrendous regimes, and he doesn't know like which one is worse essentially. And so he didn't like one, he didn't like the other. Now the Soviets decided to send him to prison. He was in the Białystok prison under very bad conditions for several months, and then they decided to deport him to the Arctic. So it's like basically the Russian Gulag system was originating at that same point. And interestingly, in the train station, because they're pushing all the prisoners in the train station, he's looking outside of the window and he sees someone that he knows from Poland, like a neighbor or someone. And he tells them, tell my family I'm in Russia and I'm okay, even though he knew he was in prison, but at least to send word that he was still alive. Interestingly enough, like many years later, when he and his sister, who also survived, reconnected, he found out that they actually did receive the message while they were in the Warsaw Ghetto.
Mm-hmm. Now let's go back to his family for a minute. So he's out. He's in Russia. He tries to come back to Poland, can't come back. Sitting in prison in Białystok, which is part of Russia. Now the family. Now Warsaw did not have a ghetto originally, correct? Like it wasn't like Venice, was it?
No. There was a section of town, northern Warsaw, was more Jewish than the rest of Warsaw,
but there wasn't any sort of gate or anything, because like Venice had a real ghetto where they could lock it up. Right. So when was a ghetto instituted in Poland and in Warsaw, and how did that influence his family?
So it took several months. The orders were, like in the first months of the German occupation, to move all the Jews in Warsaw into these certain sections. So they took the highest densely populated Jewish areas of Warsaw and basically recruited the same Jews, similar to how they recruited them to clean up the city, to build walls and gates across the perimeter of the majority Jewish side of Poland. And Doran and I, when we went to Warsaw, we saw that there's still like the line where the Warsaw, the ghetto wall used to be, which is kind of crazy to think about. But in a sense, yeah, it took several months. That's when they told the Jews in Warsaw that they had to wear armbands. It's different than in Germany. The Jews had to wear a yellow star, and in Holland, but in Poland they wore like a white stripe with a blue star, kind of like the Star of David, like on the Israeli flag. And so that's how they were marked. And so at the beginning, that was the first order. Like Jews have to be identified, and then as like it slowly progressed, they had to move in. And so different apartment buildings had to be shared by multiple families, because Jews were coming in from not just Warsaw, but from little towns right outside of Warsaw. And so it became much, much more densely populated during that time.
And so did some of his friends or family try to escape to Russia later and maybe join him?
Yes, he had a friend, Alex, who ended up escaping also. They met up later, like they weren't in the same prison or anything, but they did meet up later at some point when the Russians gave Polish citizens amnesty, and then they went to the eastern like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, but that came a lot later. In the meantime, though, his family, like his sister and his sister got married in the Warsaw Ghetto. She had a boyfriend who had died right before the war, or like right at the start of the war from a disease, and a year later she married Leon Jolson, who is my great uncle, and they got married in the Warsaw Ghetto, and they had a lot of families living in the apartment building, and so it was very much like you would imagine it's depicted in the Pianist, if you saw the movie The Pianist with Adrian Brody. So that's probably the best depiction that I can think of in terms of what the ghetto life was like. But what was interesting was my great uncle Leon he spoke fluent German, and he had very good connections with Germany and with the textile business in Warsaw. 99% of the textile business in Warsaw was under Jewish control, and he knew machines, he knew cloth, he knew how to make things, and he knew all the business people. And so he managed to befriend some of the Germans who had invaded Poland to help mend German uniforms and make underwear and socks and things like that. And so he managed to give a lot of Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto work by working for the Germans. And in the meantime, he was able to get the privilege of living in an apartment for himself and my great aunt. And so in that sense, they were able to have a bit of a more luxurious life in the Warsaw Ghetto than a lot of other Jews did, because he was able to be like the intermediary between like the occupiers and Jewish workers. So it's almost like a reverse Schindler's List, but inside the Warsaw Ghetto, if you think about it.
Wow. But that must have been very stressful as you see these laws start to increase and the pressure start to increase, and the loss of personal space and the lack of knowing what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Doron, anything you want to add at this point?
No, I mean, Ethan's telling is brilliant. I don't know how he remembers all this stuff. It's just amazing.
So now
it really is.
So back to your grandfather now. So he's in prison. How does he? And then they're going to ship him to Siberia, is it? Or not exactly Siberia?
Not quite Siberia. Arguably worse than Siberia, because Siberia is very cold. But he is sent to the port of Arkhangelsk, which is in northern Russia. So it's in the Arctic. It's in the White Sea. And part of that trip was, so they're taken to the port of Naryan Mar, and then to Arkhangelsk, and then to another city called Naryan Mar. And what's interesting, so on the side of the Soviets had very little patience for enemies of the state. And so there were, like, the Soviet prisoners were also treated very poorly. And basically in the ships that they sent to Naryan Mar and Arkhangelsk, these were very rickety ships, and some were purposely sunk, like in the middle of the ocean. And so according to my grandfather, 2 ships went out the same day, and only one ended up docking several days later. The other one was sank, and nobody cared. And then once he arrived at the port, then they were commanded to march several miles, like dozens of miles, to a wasteland in the taiga, in the Arctic taiga, and basically build their own dwellings for their own labor camp. So it was called Colony 22. And it was a labor camp that they were like a prison labor camp in Russia that had no walls. So, but even the Soviets would say, if you try to escape, go ahead. You're gonna die. It's nothing but like frozen wasteland for as far as you can see, with temperatures reaching up to 60 degrees below zero. And so, yeah, good luck if you want to try to escape. So
I remember he also mentioned like this mosquitoes, right? There were a lot of mosquitoes there, and
yeah, during the summer. But of course, he left Białystok wintertime when he went to the Arctic. It got very miserable because there's only a few months of summer and spring, but there's very bad Siberian mosquitoes. Apparently, they're very big, and they just swarm at anything that has warm blood, because there's very little of it to be found anywhere. Yeah,
it was miserable.
Great movie on Netflix. There's a great documentary on Netflix called Happy People, about the people who live in the Russian taiga and how they use like certain herbs or mosquito repellent. It's pretty fascinating.
So how long was he in the labor camp there?
He not that long, actually. So his sentence was 8 years.
So he was sentenced to 8 years for what was his crime again?
The enemy of the state.
What does that mean?
It means that he was a spy who, with no evidence, of course, except for the fact that he had documents linking him to Mexico, and one of Stalin's greatest enemies lived in Mexico at the time, who was having an affair with Frida Kahlo.
But there's no connection.
Well, the only connection was the country, and that's all they needed. That's the justice system under the Soviet system. And so he was sentenced. He was given an 8-year long sentence. But in 1941, I believe. So he was only there for maybe a year and a half or 2 years, if I remember correctly. There was an appeal to the Soviet authorities to give amnesty to Polish nationals who were in these labor camps in Siberia. And the reason was that the Soviets needed Polish citizens to fight the Nazis and the Nazi Ukrainian collaborators in the front, because they needed like language speakers and citizens. So they released Soviet citizens on that basis. And they were immediately given orders to join the General Anders, who was a famous Polish general, was, I guess, endorsed by the British, because by that point, the Allies included Britain and the Soviet Union. And so a lot of Polish citizens ended up joining this army to fight the Nazis. At that same time, Menachem Begin, the Israeli prime minister, who was also from Poland and was also in these labor camps, also was given amnesty. And he and my grandfather actually crossed paths in the train stations, because Menachem Begin was trying to recruit Jews who were also Polish citizens to abandon their posts and join him to go to Palestine. And my grandfather thought that he was like a little bit too extravagant, and decided, you know what, I probably won't join his group right now. And instead he decided, instead of going west back to fight the Germans, he decided to go east and escape like any kind of politics completely, and he went to Uzbekistan instead. Like he skipped
Uzbekistan.
Yeah. So instead of going like to the Polish front to fight in the army, he decided to escape and abandon his post.
And there again, that probably saved his life, because if he'd gone to fight in the war, the odds of being killed in the battles were very, very high.
Of course, yeah. And so he was in the east, like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan. So he was in all the stands during that time, working jobs here and there. There was a very funny story where he pretended to be a Muslim was it? I think it was still Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan. It was in Kazakhstan. And so he pretended to be a Muslim, and one of the chieftains of the town that he was with, that's when his friend Alex was there with him, apparently. They had joined together after the amnesty, and they had found each other, and so they were together for a while. And so they decided to stay at this place, pretended to be Muslims, and the chieftain was so amazed by my grandfather's reciting of Allahu Akbar and Muhammad, because apparently that's the only phrases he knew in Arabic, that he decided to marry him to his daughter, who spoke fluent Russian and also spoke Polish, but was, according to my grandfather, the ugliest woman he had ever seen in his life. And so he and his friend decided to skip like that night, because the wedding was scheduled for the following morning. So they escaped. They swam like across several rivers, and they basically fled marriage. So it was a different kind of persecution in that. Yeah, and eventually though he ended up joining the Soviet army eventually, like going back. I forgot exactly what the details were in terms of how he managed that, but he knew the Polish language well by then. He knew Russian very well, and so he became like an officer in the Soviet army, and he was in a position to fight, and he did fight against the Ukrainians in several battles, actually. And yeah. So I think my AirPods are about to die, so I'm going to disconnect them and go to my.
Can you hear me still? Can you hear me now? We can't hear you.
Okay.
Now
we can hear you.
Okay, you're back. There's one scene in the book that I do remember that Alex and your grandfather Yitzhak pull in. They're like secretly on a train they're not supposed to be on, and they're like hiding in a empty cargo compartment or something, and they pull into a stop, and Alex goes to find bread. And the train is supposed to be there 20 minutes, but it leaves early. And that's how they become permanently separated. And I actually, I asked, did you ever find Alex? And he said, no, never, in many years afterwards was able to reestablish connection. What happened there?
I guess, Doron, you know the story because you met Alex, right?
Right. I mean, what happened there, I don't remember, but yes, they met in the United States.
Oh, so they did reunite.
Yes, they did.
Oh.
Many decades.
And Alex wandered around.
And he was his best friend in America when he came to the United States. He was continued being his best friend for many years.
Oh, wow. Where did Alex live?
In Los Angeles.
Oh, okay.
And my father, we it's part of the story. I'll probably talk later, but I was born in Mexico because my father, after the Second World War, he went to Israel. He fought the independence war from Israel, and then he went to Mexico. So the cycle closes to meet his sister that originally went to Mexico before the war. So this is a big cycle, of life.
So he wandered around in the stands for quite a while and then ended up finally in the Soviet army, and then the war ends. So Yitzhak goes back to Poland to look for his family?
Yeah, so that's also very interesting. So he hears from an acquaintance that he had while he was still in the Soviet army that his family was killed. They were all sent to Treblinka. And he said, even Anya? And the person said, yes, even Anya. Everyone is dead. And so he was very depressed. And he told his commander, I want to fight in the front lines. I want to die with the rifle in my hand. I don't want to passively die. I want to actively die. And so he fought for, I don't know how long, but it was several battles. He said that there was a lot of killing. He did a lot of very terrible things that he would never want to repeat to anyone. Yes, if you can imagine the frustration and the pain that he must have felt, knowing that he was the last of his family to have survived. He didn't feel any will to live. But then when he did arrive to Poland, he went to his, I believe it was his former house, and a neighbor or a housekeeper that they knew said, no, Anya lived, Anya escaped. And so that rejuvenated him with a new sense of life. And the woman told them, oh, you should go to this address in Kopernika 2 or something in Warsaw. That's where they were hiding. And he finds a letter that Anya had written to him specifically to come here. And that's where he meets his brother-in-law, Leon, for the first time. He didn't see his sister, but he saw Leon was there, and Leon was like, hello, I am your brother-in-law. You haven't met me yet. But your sister Anya is safe. She's in Germany at a displacement camp, and so that's where they went. They went to Munich, and that's where he was reunited with his sister Anya. And during that time, there were several choices. So Anya and Leon went to New York, and my grandfather instead went to France, and he stayed in France because he had relatives. Brother and a sister of his mother who survived and lived in Paris, who had also survived the war. So he had an aunt and an uncle who lived in Paris, and he stayed with them until 1946, I believe, or 1947. And from there, he was part of the Exodus. He left it from the port of Marseille to Israel.
He was part of the ship, the Exodus?
Not the Exodus, but Exodus is there were a lot of illegal ships leaving Europe to go to Palestine during that time.
So he went to Marseille, which is southern France, and then he got up. The Jewish agency was packing these boats with refugees, right. And he got on one, and the British didn't catch the boat, so they entered.
Right. So they managed to enter. I think that was 1947 or 48. I think it was 47. But he was with a bunch of Romanian Jews. It was him, a fellow Polish person, and a bunch of Romanian Jews.
And how did they could speak to each other?
I think in the little Yiddish that they knew, they managed to speak to each other. I mean, Yiddish was the lingua franca among Jews everywhere in Eastern Europe. But what's interesting about, oh, yes.
Yeah, no, I think it's important to mention, from the family, Maritza that went to Mexico survived, Anya and my father, but the rest of the family, they died in Treblinka.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there's other like distant relatives who survived, had their own survival stories, like the Middlebergs and the like.
Yeah, but from the close family, the parents, the sister Dorenka.
Yeah, and so another interesting and while of destiny, when they arrived in Israel, it was never mind. It was 1948 because it was already the start of the Israeli War of Independence. So they arrived in Israel. And apparently the Polish person that my grandfather befriended had family in Tel Aviv, and they requested the Israeli army because immediately as Jews came, they were recruited into the Israeli army to fight the Arabs. And my grandfather and his Polish friend decided or asked for permission to go to have Shabbat dinner at the friend's family's house. And meanwhile, the Romanians were sent to Latrun, which was
yes.
on the border between Jordan and Israel at that time. And all of the Romanians that were on the ship with my grandfather were slaughtered that night. There was a massacre. The Jordanians came in at night and they killed everyone in that camp. And so it's another lucky turn of events that saved his life, just going to Shabbat dinner because the commander said, okay, you can take this weekend off because you just arrived and there's family here that you can spend time with. And then he ended up joining the Israeli army, and because when he was in the Soviet Polish army, he commanded a brigade, like an auto brigade. Oh, that's another thing I forgot to mention, that at the end of the war, he was part of the group of individuals, the first to arrive at the concentration camp of Majdanek in Poland. So it was near Treblinka. It was another death camp. And he was one of the first to arrive. The camp had already been liquidated. And the only people that were left were just a handful of guards and a Nazi guard in the middle of the camp. And so that's when he described, that's when he first experienced truly what the atrocities of the Nazis were, because he hadn't seen what they had done. He'd only heard the rumors. But when he arrived in Majdanek, he said, you couldn't imagine mountains, like he said, literal mountains of shoes, mountains of eyeglasses, mountains of clothing, just in piles everywhere, and then dead bodies scattered everywhere. And so that was before he went to France. But I thought it was interesting to mention, important to mention. Yeah, so that's when it truly hit him what had happened, and that's what motivated him to leave everything, go to France, and find his family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, so he ended up in Israel, and when he was in the army, he drove trucks and commanded a brigade of trucks for transportation and things like that. And then in Israel, he commanded an ambulance brigade, like the trucks that would take people away from the front lines who were injured. And so that's what he did in the Israeli army. And
then he met my mother.
Yeah,
that was a secretary of Moshe Dayan. Remember Moshe Dayan with the parched eye? And married my mother, and I think he spent another war, right? The 56 war. And then he decided.
The second Arab-Israeli war, the Suez Crisis. And that's when he said, I can't. It's too much death. Like, he's experienced too much death, too much dying, too much killing. He said, as much as he loved Israel and the Jewish people, he said, I can't stay here anymore. And so he went to Mexico.
My brother, which is Ethan Fathers, he was born in Israel. He's an Israeli.
Mm-hmm. Oh. Yeah, so my father was born in Tel Aviv in 1954. And then in 1957, they moved to Mexico City.
Oh, wow.
And then Doron is born in Mexico City in 1961.
And then he liked Mexico?
Yeah, at the beginning, yeah, especially my mother. My mother loved Mexico because the social life in Mexico was like Tel Aviv. But then things became very complicated in Mexico.
Okay,
so my father.
Then there was economic problems and political problems, and then eventually they decided to move to El Paso, Texas.
Right, because of the other sister that survived, Anya, went to New York, and through Anya, we were able to get the papers to move to the United States.
And I visited your grandmother when I was a scholar in residence in El Paso. I don't know how many years ago was that.
About 5.
Yeah.
And then my brother met his wife in El Paso. Ethan was born. My other 2 nephews were born. And we are here.
My brother recently had a baby, so the next generation.
In Germany, and this is amazing. My other nephew went to German, married a German woman, and has a boy that had a breeze in Germany. So the whole cycle is going back. Yeah. It's amazing.
Wow. And so you've come out, meanwhile, with the 2nd edition of the book. If you could show the book again, and I believe you're preparing now a 3rd edition.
Yeah, it's in the works. My grandfather wrote the book very factually. Like he said, like this happened, then this happened, then this happened. So it's almost as if you're reading bullet points. Like these are all the things that happened to me, et cetera, et cetera. So, and my grandfather was such a great storyteller. He would embellish a lot of things with a lot of detail. And I feel like a lot of that was missing from the actual book. And so I'm working on it to try to add historical context to a lot of the things he was saying, and adding more imagery, especially since Doran and I went to Poland in 2015. Like it's a different, you get a different perspective having already walked the same streets and things like that. So all these little things I want to add in a 3rd edition.
But especially going to Terbinkla was very, very hard, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And Yitzhak was interviewed by the Steven Spielberg interview. What is it called?
The Shoah Foundation from University of Southern California.
And they interviewed him at length on video.
Yes, they interviewed him, my great aunt Anya, and my great uncle Leon.
Together?
No, separately. Each one told their own story.
I see. And that's available if we would want to see that as well?
Yeah, just YouTube. Yitzhak Kutkowski and Anya Kutkowski. They're both on YouTube.
Now, does this story, this inspirational story of your grandfather and your father, does it have any impact on your lives that you're aware of today that you can summarize? I mean, has it changed how you feel about life and about things?
Doran, do you want to go first?
Well, when I'm in trouble or have problems, I just try to put in perspective what my father went through, and I said, no, don't be so. This is the worst thing in life, and his will to live, right? Because I don't know how he did it. I don't think I have that. I mean, the cold, the hunger, the family that he left, and still have this will to live. It's amazing.
Hey, Tom.
I think, I could probably speak for my brothers and I, that it's a big part of our identity. Like we carry the family name. So that's obviously very important. We're Mexican Jews who speak Spanish and yet have this name that we always have to explain to people whenever I get interviewed for like medical school or residency. I'm like, wait a second, you're Hispanic and you have this name?
Right.
And so it always brings it in perspective. Like I tell this story because it is essentially who I am. Like it is my name, and I wouldn't be here if he wouldn't have gone through and suffered as much as he suffered to survive. And so, yeah, I am as much a part of he is as him than anything. So it drives us, like Doran was saying, like it puts a lot of things in perspective, especially since we're the last generation to have been able to talk to survivors of the Holocaust, which is very sad, but like it's the passage of time. But essentially, like it's a story that we will continue to pass down to our children and our grandchildren and great grandchildren if we get to meet them. And now with things that are on YouTube immortalized, like it's a story that can easily be told for many generations to come, exactly as he said them and exactly as he wrote them. So it's something that we definitely carry with us forever, and it's part of who we are, and there's no distancing ourselves from it.
Well, I want to thank the two of you for being here today, and it's really an inspirational story, and so thank you again.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Hopefully people in the book club can read the book, and feel free to Google or YouTube my grandfather telling his actual story from the first person.
Now, eventually we want to have this book once you finish the editing as an ebook, right? That's the goal.
Yes, there's like medical school has put a big break on me working on it, but yeah, my goal is eventually like slowly get through it, and once it's in a good position to get published, then record a very nice audio version of it. Get someone with a good voice who probably has a Polish accent to read it. But yeah, that would be the ideal.
Thank you again, both of you.
Thank you.